My name's Chris Irons. First off, I guess I just want to say thanks to Nate and Zach for having me back. It's cool to be back here. It's nice to see that the event has gotten a little bit bigger since last year. It's good to see that the crowd's gotten a little bit bigger. So we're moving in the right direction, and it's for a great cause, and it's really nice. So most of you guys know me. If you don't follow me on Twitter, then you probably bumped into me literally at the bar last night. My name's Chris Irons. You know me on Twitter as Quote the Raven. If you follow me, I work with Maj also at Geo Investing, where primarily we do two things. We look for microcap companies like Maj was talking about, and little pockets of information arbitrage. Information basically that the market hasn't really, the entire market right now is covered by algorithms and computers. You know, I put up a thing the other day on my Twitter that said market participants, and it was basically just a picture of a bunch of servers, you know, like in an IBM lab somewhere. Because that's basically what it is. And microcaps are really the only area of the market that haven't been covered by everybody and everything yet. So we try to find those little niches in the market and exploit where we can get a little bit of information arbitrage here and there. And in addition to that, we do, you know, what Maj calls portfolio protection, what I call short activism also. You know, we have different terms for it, you know, for legal reasons and preference reasons. But we do like to do a fair amount of investigative due diligence also on companies. And it's nice to go out and hopefully be able to warn the marketplace about some less than savory elements of companies that people, you know, haven't necessarily pointed out. So, if you'll excuse me, I have some prepared remarks here. Just give me a moment. This is actually draft 2 of my prepared remarks. Draft 1 is on a cocktail napkin somewhere at the bar last night. All right, so this speech that I'm going to give here was originally titled "Why the Entire Global Economy is Rigged," and then they told me I only have 15 minutes. So I figured I would just dial it down a little bit and take a very small cross-section of that. I actually think I'm the reason that there's time limits this year. If you guys were here last year, it got a little out of hand. So anyways, yeah, I'm kind of a, unfortunately, doom and gloom type guy when it comes to the markets. I don't really buy into the whole system for better or for worse. And the system as we know it really is this, you know, Federal Reserve kind of couched marketplace where financial assets must always be going up, and inflation, prices rising, are somehow, you know, a good thing. The Federal Reserve thinks it's a great thing that you used to pay 15 cents for a coffee and now it's like $6 here at the Wynn. That makes sense to the Federal Reserve for some reason. I don't know why, but in addition to that, you know, the Federal Reserve has basically catalyzed the market going from, you know, the Dow at 1,000 or 2,000 to where it is now, you know, 22, 23,000, and it'll be, according to Warren Buffett, you know, 1 million in 20 years. And they think that's a good thing, and nobody really stops to think of why that happens. Like, why does the market always go up? You know, why is Warren Buffett allowed to go on television and be like, you know, just buy and hold stocks, you know, for 50 years, you know, and stocks will outperform everything else? And nobody's like, well, why is that? Like, when you look at a chart of the Dow Jones, like, why does the line just go straight up? Because that's not really what a market is, right? A market is, you have some participants, you have some type of product or service, you have some type of currency, and then supply and demand is essentially supposed to generate which way things are going to go, which way prices will go, how in demand a product will be. And when you look at a market for something that, you know, the government isn't involved in, like televisions or cell phones, what you see is the price has pretty much stayed the same. Like with TVs, $1,000 now can buy you a TV like this one here, like a nice-ass flat-screen television. Where like 20 years ago, $1,000 would buy you this, you know, the pretty much big clunky CRT television. So now you get a lot more bang for your buck, even though the dollar has actually, the purchasing power of the dollar has actually gone down in the same amount of time. And the reason that things get cheaper is because when the government doesn't come in and screw up the works, it encourages companies to compete, to be more productive, to make a better product, to make something that's going to sell better, and to really to innovate and keep the price point the same. And what happens with things that the Federal Reserve does get involved in and that the government does get involved in, all you need to do is look at college tuitions right now. I mean, there's numerous bubbles, and I could talk for hours about all of them, but just look at college tuitions now, right? College tuitions are extremely expensive. They're the most expensive they've ever been. And the reason that they are is because all student loans are backed by the government. So when you go and you get a student loan, that's essentially insured by the Federal Reserve right now. They're going to back that one way or another. They're going to say, if the bubble eventually goes bust, we're going to be there to bail it out. So what happens? Do you get better education for the same amount, like with televisions? You know, does $17,000 20 years ago get you the same education or a better education or a much better education, like a much better television 20 years from then? No, it doesn't. What that gets you is, you know, maybe half of a semester at University of Phoenix, where you're going to have a degree that, no offense to anybody who's taken online courses, and I have as well, so I'm allowed to say this, but you'll have a degree that's mostly worthless. And so the quality of the product has gone down, and the price has gone up, because the colleges don't feel like they need to compete, because they know that people are going to be able to get loans without any type of issue, and all those loans are going to be backed by the government. And this is exactly what happened with the housing crisis in 2008. Everybody says the problem was that bankers were going and allowing people to take out mortgages without any type of, credentials. They were issuing these no-doc loans, and it was the greedy mortgage bankers, and it was, the greedy investment banks that really screwed up the works in 2008. But the fact is, if those banks didn't know that they were backed up by the government and that the government had their back in 2008, they would have never gone out and did that. What would happen is, if the government didn't back the banks, banks would have to compete, meaning they would have to take on more creditworthy borrowers. And they would only have to lend to people that they know are going to be able to pay it back. And so, just like now, you guys all have bank accounts, I have a bank account, right? Probably 90% of the room here is covered by JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, one of the 5 or 6 huge big banks. And if you're like me, you don't really give a shit which bank it is. Yeah, whatever. I moved up to Canada a couple years ago. I went from TD to Bank of America. I went from Bank of America back to TD. I don't really care. Whatever the fees are, I'm going to pay it. Sign me up. It's federally insured. I don't care. And what would happen in a situation where the government wasn't involved with banks and they didn't insure your account, sounds like it would be like a big scary thing, right? The government doesn't have my back, whatever. But it would force the banks to go out and be more transparent with you with what they're doing with your money when you deposit it in the bank. The banks would essentially have to compete. So just like with student loans, and just like with 2008, and just like with the banks, okay, the government being involved is a problem, right? If you've ever gone to the DMV, or you've ever done your taxes, or you've ever done anything involved with the government, you know very clearly government involvement does not make things more efficient. It doesn't make things easier. It just screws up the works entirely. So, why would we think that the government micromanaging the economy and micromanaging the stock market is going to be a successful enterprise over the course of the long term, right? The stock market goes up over time because earnings go up, and earnings go up because prices go up, and prices go up because of inflation. And inflation is a product of a theory, Keynesian theory, or new Keynesian theory, or whatever the hell you want to, I just call it bullshit, that the Federal Reserve has been using for 40 or 50 years now. And this is the theory that means when we have a bubble, when something goes burst, when we have a 2008, when we have a 2000, the government has to get involved. And they have to create stimulus. They need to encourage spending at those points. They need to lower interest rates. And all that does is it creates a bigger bubble. 2008 was a product of 2000. It was a product of what the government did after 2000, right? And the next crisis, whenever it happens, shouldn't be too long from now, according to my calculations, although I've been saying that for about 6 years. But the next crisis is going to be even worse, because what you see is interest rates that used to be at 5%, 10%, and the government would have some room to come in and lower them in the event of a stimulus type of event where they need to stimulate the economy. They're not going to be able to do that anymore. Rates will go back to zero eventually, and the government will throw all of this money back into the banking system. They'll buy treasury bonds the way that they've been doing, the way that they're doing overseas. And eventually, what that will lead to is, I believe, a currency collapse. Now, that is a fairly catastrophic problem. I don't know if you saw what happened to Venezuela recently, but basically their currency collapsed entirely, and they experienced hyperinflation, which is when prices go way, way up and the value of your currency goes way, way down. The dollar used to be the reserve currency of the world because it used to be backed by gold, right? So you could keep it down here in front? No, I'm just playing around. But the dollar used to be backed by gold, and people used the dollar as a reserve currency because at the end of the day, you could take your dollar and you could bring it to the bank, or you could bring it to, the government ostensibly anywhere, and they would be able to give you a certain amount of a finite fixed product of which there is a limited supply for that dollar, right? So that pegged the dollar to something that you can't roll off a printing press like we're doing right now with dollars, right? And that's why the dollar became the reserve currency of the world. But in the 70s, when we depegged the dollar from gold, all we have now is we have nothing. We have sheets of paper that are Federal Reserve notes that the government says, we've got your back on this. And the entire global economy, right, still uses the dollar as its reserve currency. Even though the dollar is backed by, that pastry, basically, that guy's got on his plate right there. It's got nothing behind it. It's fluff. It's nothing. It's a confidence game, right? So a currency crisis would be devastating. And it could happen from any number of things. It could happen from, a giant fraud going bust leading to a recession. It could happen from, interest rates moving a little bit higher. Is it likely in our lifetime? Maybe. I'd say maybe. I give it 10%, right? But for me, that's about enough to concern me and, give me severe anxiety and panic attacks and just make me skeptical of the whole system, right? So one of the reasons that I always like to have a small portion of my portfolio invested in gold, or it doesn't even have to be gold, any type of precious metal, any type of commodity where there's a limited supply, right? Even Maj thinks my whole macroeconomic theory is bullshit, and that's fine. That's why we get along so well at work. So the point of the whole speech here that I'm trying to give is, I always keep a small portion of my portfolio in something that has a finite supply. I like precious metals. If you don't want to invest in precious metals, you don't want to invest in commodities, things that there's a limited amount of here on Earth, you can go into emerging markets, you can look at foreign currencies, but what I recommend is I recommend taking a small portion, 10% maybe, of your portfolio and having it fixed in something like gold that is a hedge not only against the market, right, but it's against the whole system. This whole system that the Fed has been using for the last 50 years is unprecedented. They've taken thousands of years of economic law, basic supply and demand. Interest rates used to be determined by supply and demand. The supply of what people have to lend out and the demand of what people want to borrow. And that would determine an interest rate. Now, these guys sit around a table and they pick their ass, and then they just move a little dial, and all of a sudden interest rates go higher or lower. And what happens is instead of interest rates becoming a product of the market, interest rates determine this giant aftershock that the rest of the market feels. So to hedge against that, and to hedge against Fed theory, which, again, I think is unprecedented, and eventually it may not be in our lifetime, but eventually could lead to some unprecedented catastrophe, some unprecedented volatility, is to get into something like gold, own a little bit, just so you have a hedge, not only against the market. If the market corrects, gold will obviously go up, but you have a hedge also against the dollar, which is, I think, over the course of a long term, over the course of a lifetime, it's great to have money tied up in equities. Hopefully the stock market continues to go up. Warren Buffett will probably continue to be right. That's why he's a billionaire, and I'm standing here drinking a mimosa at 11:30 in the morning. But I would always just say, just have an open enough mind to know that the system is run by the government. The government is not very efficient. The government is made up of people that are not the brightest tools in the shed, not the sharpest tools in the shed, the brightest bulb. I juxtapose my analogies. It's very early in the morning. I'm sorry. So what I would say is just take a look at that when you leave here today, consider the idea of hedging not only against our market, but hedging against our currency and hedging against government policy. Because I guarantee you, there's far more brain power in this room right now than there is with the people sitting around the table at the Federal Open Markets Committee. So thank you guys very much for your time.